So, today I'd like to talk about systems collapse and transformation in Southeast Asia. So, between the 1st century AD and the 18th century AD. I think in history, when we talk about Southeast Asia, it's always a matter of war. Everything is always because of war and conflict. We don't really look at systems as a whole. We don't look at the kingdoms, how they are interrelated, how they're connected through trade, through payment of tribute. And we assume that everybody's at war with each other, nobody likes each other, and we forget there is a very strong, a large economic trade that's going on in Southeast Asia well before the Europeans appeared in Southeast Asia in the 14th or 15th centuries. The world we live in, and same in the Mediterranean, it's the same in the Middle East, Mesopotamia, Persia, you name it, even Egypt as well, Greece, Rome, Syria. Every single region has repeatedly been shaped by collapse and change, but not collapse as a single catastrophe. Civilizations fall due to multiple interconnected stresses. It could be drought, it could be famine, it could be because of natural disasters. There is a breakdown in trade, a disagreement on terms and conditions of trade. Does happen, happens today. And of course, last but not least, everybody's favorite, warfare. So these forces, all these things, these multipliers, drought, famine, natural disaster, a breakdown in relationships of trade, warfare, they create a domino effect. They can create a domino effect. They did create a domino effect. So what you have, now when we talk about famine and drought, what happens? People start running out of food. Okay, that's the first thing that happens. People become desperate. Economies then collapse because there's not enough rice, there's not enough grain to trade for, to raise coin. So economic systems fail, political authority weakens, and then societies either disappear because they collapse, people migrate, people die, or they learn to adapt. So it's one or the other. They either adapt or they disappear. So the framework this framework of collapse of systems, it's highly relevant to Southeast Asia between the 1st and the 18th centuries. It's a region that's deeply dependent on trade networks, environmental stability between all the different kingdoms, including the empires, and political legitimacy. Political legitimacy recognized by the emperors, the various emperors of China, with whom all these polities in Southeast Asia do trade with, because China is very important to the economic well-being and trade of many of these kingdoms and empires. So we talk about polities like Funan, we talk about Champa. These were not isolated kingdoms. They were part of a larger Indian Ocean, South China Sea trading system. Their survival depended on three things: stable monsoon cycles so that you could travel by ship from one point to the other. There were no steam engines, there were no electric engines, there were no diesel engines. Everything was dependent on wind, the power of the wind. So sails and which direction the winds blew were very important, vital to move from port to port. Agriculture productivity, very important for trade, very important for the health and well-being of society, of any kingdom and any empire. Maritime trade, again, linked to winds. So the ability to carry out maritime trade ensured wealth, ensured economic well-being, ensured an exchange of coin for products, barter trading perhaps. Very important, these three things. But when you have environmental changes such as rivers becoming shallower, narrower, filling up with silt, there's a shift because ships are no longer able to go upriver to these ports. Funan being the example. And this leads to a decline in routes, trade routes. Less ships come means poverty. You start losing coin, you start losing wealth, you start becoming a poor kingdom. So when this happens, what do you do? Do you stay where you are or do you move? In the case of Funan, they had to move. Not only that, they eventually got pushed out of the trade business by their neighbors, the Champa. And so once economic systems fail, political systems follow. They also weaken, sometimes collapse, Other times they are re-established somewhere else and they continue all over again. And other times empires are no longer empires, kingdoms become empires, they decline in the ability to pay for their army, to pay for their navy, to pay for their mercenary force, and they merely become a small kingdom all over again. Brunei being a prime example. So firstly, the Spanish take away the Philippines from Brunei. Then the Bruneians are at war with their old friends and cousins, the Sultanate of Sulu, who then stop collecting tribute payments from the east coast of Sabah, and then eventually are their rivals and their major enemies. There is the problem of the arrival of the Dutch, who then change the terms of trade in Southeast Asia. So what happens is Brunei suffers. Less trade ships come to Brunei. And these trading partners are no longer trading with Brunei, they are trading directly with the Dutch and the Portuguese and then the English, who turn up a little bit later. So this affects Brunei financially. Brunei declines as a wealthy empire to merely a sultanate, and a very weak sultanate by the time we get to the late 1700s. In fact, they don't even have control of many of the rivers that they once controlled in Sabah, for example, where they collected tribute and taxation. James Brooke just merely nails the coffin when he takes Sarawak. And then you have Baron von Overbeck and Alfred Dent who take Sabah for Brunei. What does Brunei have left after that? That declines over time. It is not sudden, it happens over time, over several centuries. So empires and interconnected collapses. So by the 7th and 14th centuries, you have powerful empires, such as the Srivijaya Empire from Sumatra. They decline. They turn up sort of the 7th century until the 14th century, and then sort of disappear after that, never to be heard again. The last 100 or 200 years, people have struggled to figure out where exactly was Srivijaya, where exactly was the capital of Srivijaya. And nobody could tell. Nobody could find these archaeological sites of where Srivijaya once existed until recently. It's only really in the last 100 or 200 years they've sort of figured out, okay, maybe this is where it was, right, near Palembang. But that's what can happen. Then you have Angkor Wat as well. Same thing. Declines as a major kingdom. An empire, you could argue it was an empire of sorts. Yeah. Do you see the example I'm giving? What can happen? The Srivijaya depended on controlling the maritime chok in what is today the Straits of Malacca. They controlled all the trade that passed through. So you had to either trade with them or you had to pay them taxes. But then you have external shocks that disrupted trade networks. It weakened the political authority of Srivijaya. Same with the Angkor Wat as well. Hydraulic systems collapsed under prolonged drought, intense flooding. And then they had external military pressures. So it's a number of factors that created this perfect storm that led to its collapse. So all you were left with is archaeological buildings of Angkor Wat, but no more kingdom, no more people. And that is what you have today as well. Environmental stress as a trigger, very important. I talked a little bit earlier about drought and famine. So Southeast Asia is dependent on the monsoon, not only for trade and movement of trade ships and for economic wealth as well, right? Trade at all ports, but the monsoons are very important for crops. And so when you have a prolonged period of drought, crops failed. What follows? Famine. And so once you have famine, and it's not just one season, we're talking about multiple years of drought. So there's a shift in the environment. This could be linked to what is happening in the world around these various kingdoms. There could have been a major volcanic eruption. There could have been major earthquakes. There could have been tsunamis. There could also have been weather changes, weather pattern changes. No rain for an extended period of time. Just hot weather, no rain. Rivers dry up. Crops fail. So you can't plant rice, which is a staple diet, an absolutely vital diet for the the human being, the Southeast Asian. These environmental stresses amplified existing weaknesses in political and economic systems. And so many of these kingdoms lost their legitimacy. They collapsed. And so when you have collapse and transformation, some kingdoms disappeared, others transformed. So unlike some ancient civilizations, Southeast Asian kingdoms, not all of them experience a total collapse. Okay, so Srivijaya disappears over time. The Majapahit disappear over time. So let's take Singapore, for example. You had a Raja who we believe came from what is Sumatra, possibly a part of the Srivijaya royalty, arrives in Singapore, kills the existing Raja there, takes over the kingdom, and he eventually is removed. He or his descendants are removed from Singapore by Siam because they refuse to potentially pay tribute or taxes to Siam, or Siam took revenge for the killing of the previous Raja. And so what happens? This is a period of decline. Srivijaya is getting weak. This Raja escapes north across to Johor, makes his way to a little village called Melaka, and what happens then? Several years later, suddenly the Melaka Sultanate is founded. So a Hindu king or Hindu Raja embraces Islam, becomes a sultan, and that is sort of the rise of the Melaka Sultanate. But again, it only lasts for a very short period of time, because what happens? From the 16th century onwards, that's the early 1500s, who arrives? The Europeans. So you have the Portuguese, you have the Dutch, you have then eventually the English, all turn up over that period of time with a 200-300 year period. And so the Malacca Sultanate doesn't last very long. You know, the Portuguese conquer Malacca in 1511. So what? Malacca had maybe 100, slightly over 100 years of growth and economic success. There's a disruption in the trade networks. There's a transformation of political structures. The Europeans now have influence within Southeast Asia, and they start carving up Southeast Asia. So you see what happens after this. Something completely different happens. The Europeans now are playing an important role in Southeast Asia. Systems are forced to change. So you have Funan disappearing, you have Champa disappearing, Angkor Wat over time disappears, Malacca Sultanate disappears. Okay, well, Malacca escapes down south to Johor. They build up a relationship with the kingdoms in the Riau Lingi Islands, and then eventually Raffles arrives in Singapore, negotiates with Temanggung and so forth. And then suddenly, an island with all villages, small communities, suddenly transforms itself into a major economic and trading hub, Singapore. So you see how this changed. Malacca collapses, Singapore rises. So collapses are uneven, and there are many varied outcomes all around Southeast Asia. So at the end of this, I would say collapse or change in systems does not mean it is the end of civilization. It is a process of change, a process of transformation. Some empires fall, some kingdoms fall, disappear, never to be seen again. New ones rise, and systems are rebuilt in new forms. The collapse is merely the engine of historical change. Whilst other kingdoms evolve, they transform themselves to adapt to what has changed in the region. So, for example, all the different kingdoms in Java are trading with the Portuguese and the Dutch, and then eventually the English. But the English and the Portuguese are pushed out, and so they then have to adapt and deal directly with the Dutch. The Portuguese move north to China, establish a base in Macau. The English establish themselves in Penang, in Singapore, eventually in Brunei and in Sabah. That is systems collapse. That is transformation in Southeast Asia.